Hey everyone, welcome. Today we are going to look at monopolies. This is chapter 9 in the OpenStax Principles of Microeconomics textbook, and this is following on what we learned in the last chapter. The last chapter looked at perfect competition and markets in sort of our ideal situation of having many firms, many consumers, and everybody being a price taker. Monopolies are on the opposite end of our market structure spectrum. One firm, a price maker, and what we're going to see is they're going to tend to earn profits, lots of them. So today what we're going to look at in this video is how a monopolist decides the quantities to produce, what we see monopolies tend to do in terms of welfare. We're going to look at the nature of monopolies, some common types of monopolies, natural monopolies, legal monopolies, those kinds of things. And then we'll just see how a profit maximizing monopolist chooses the optimal quantity, output, and price. It's going to be totally different, kind of the opposite of what a perfectly competitive market does. So let's take a look. Okay, so here we are in chapter 9 looking at monopolies, and the book starts out, well, first we want to see where we're going to go. We are going to look first at where monopolies come from, and the short answer is barriers to entry, but there's a lot of different versions of that answer, so we'll look at that first. And then we'll look at how a profit-maximizing monopoly chooses its optimal level of output and price, and we're going to focus a little bit on how it's similar to and different from what a profit-maximizing firm does in a perfectly competitive market. And so we're constantly going to be making those comparisons between these different market structures. So let's get into it. The book starts out with this very weird example of the political power that can be derived from monopoly. And what it chooses to look at is the near monopoly or the large amount of market power that the United States and the South in the United States had in the 1860s. In the 1860s, the United States had become a world power through its, in part, economic dominance of the cotton market, in no small part to the, both the endowment of good land and the use of enslaved labor in order to really keep their costs low. And so in the 1860s, the southern states attempted to use this economic power from this cotton monopoly to try and garner or earn some political power, military support from Great Britain. And the idea here is just to give us a sense of how powerful monopoly powers can be on the global scale. So, something to think about. When we talk about what a monopoly is, we want to be very clear. True perfect monopolies aren't super common. What we see a lot of is generally a lot of market power. But a monopoly basically means one firm produces all of the output in the market. It's going to depend how we define that market. The more broadly the market is defined, the more power the monopolist has. So think about the difference between having a monopoly in Levi's versus having a monopoly in pants, and how available it is, how easy it is to get a substitution. But generally, however we define a market, a monopolist in that market would be the only producer of that good or service. And monopolies are created with barriers to entry. And barriers to entry just mean there's something that prohibits other firms from entering the market. There are lots of different kinds of barriers to entry. There are legal barriers to entry. We'll talk about that. That's usually some kind of property right, like copyrights or patents. There are technological barriers to entry. So if you have a certain technology no one else has, that might create a barrier to entry. And then there can just plain market forces can discourage or prevent other firms, other competitors from entering the market. So it can be things like high costs of entering the market or the nature of the cost curves. And when we talk about the nature of the cost curves, what we're really talking about here is natural monopolies. And so I'm just going to do a quick graph here. We remember hopefully from last time looking at perfect competition that a competitive firm is going to have a marginal cost curve that looks like this, and an average total cost curve that looks kind of like this. A natural monopoly is a situation where the barriers to entry are such that it prohibits or makes it too expensive for other firms to enter. And so a lot of times in a natural monopoly, what we'll see is an average cost curve that looks more like this. And it's not that it won't eventually go up, it's that it would go up at such a high quantity. So maybe this is the optimal size of this firm is Q equal to 100. Maybe the optimal size of a natural monopoly is more than 100,000, maybe more than 1 million, something like that. Natural monopolies are going to tend to be things like utilities. So my favorite example is a sewer system. If you want to start a sewer company, what's the first thing you have to do? Well, sewer systems bring and remove water and waste from houses with underground pipes. So if you want to have a sewer system, you have to go in and lay pipes, sewer pipes, to every house you want to have access to and provide service to. That's a really, really, really high cost up front. But then once you do that, the marginal cost, the cost per unit of providing that service is relatively low. So when we think about utilities like gas, electricity, sewer, water, those tend to be natural monopolies because those tend to have very high fixed costs associated with production, high infrastructure costs, and really low per unit costs. And so that's where we'll see natural monopolies prevail. Another kind of monopoly is a legal monopoly. And when we say legal monopoly, what we mean is it's sort of granted by the government or created by a law. And so usually these are going to be copyright laws and patents, intellectual property rights. And what we're saying here is that if you create something, sometimes we give you permission to be a monopolist. And the most common example of this is in the pharmaceutical industry. If you put tons of money into the research and development of some new miracle drug, you don't want to compete with anyone for a while. And so we have patents and intellectual property laws that allow firms to be a monopolist, at least for a few years. And the idea is that lets them recoup or make up their profits, the cost of the research and development. And so we'll create these legal monopolies, usually to help incentivize firms, to give them an incentive to pursue innovation that's really, really expensive. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions. Let me know if you can think of other examples of legal and natural monopolies. But that means that we can see natural monopolies in industries where the marginal cost of adding an extra unit is relatively low, but the fixed costs of having the system in place are really high. We can also see it in small local markets where it's difficult to transport things. So if you think about if you've ever lived someplace rural, a lot of times rural economies have a lot of natural monopolies because there's just not an incentive for a lot of companies to provide goods and services. So if you think about a city like Sacramento, lots of grocery stores, lots of producers, lots of sellers of lots of different kinds of goods, right? Lots of diversity in restaurants and rental cars and that kind of thing. On the other hand, if you think about a town or a city with a small population, maybe only 1,000 people, it might not make sense for there to be 2 rental car companies or more than 1 or 2 grocery stores. There's just not enough consumer base for there to be a lot of firms. It just doesn't make sense. And we can also see a natural monopoly arise when one company has control of a scarce resource. So, for example, in the diamond market, a lot of diamonds go through 1 or 2 main companies because there is one firm that owns the majority of diamond mines. And so they have access to that rare input. So think about your own life. Think about the natural monopolies you engage with. Think about your utilities. A lot of people experience a natural monopoly with internet service. Depending on where you live, you might not have lots of firms competing to provide you internet service, and we tend to see high prices there. And so think about what that means, what the fixed costs of infrastructure, of setting up the framework for internet service are versus the per unit or per customer marginal cost. Does that make sense? Hopefully. Okay. So when we think about natural monopolies, they're going to have these cost curves that look like this. And like I said, it's not that the cost curve doesn't go up. It's that the long run average cost curve doesn't go up until we're at a very, very high quantity. And that's usually going to mean that demand is on the downward sloping part of the long run average cost curve. If demand was, say, over here at 20,000 or even 25, 30,000, then we would have enough demand to have one or two, maybe even three firms. But if the long run average cost curve for producing a good looks like this long run average cost curve, and demand in the whole market is just 4,000 units, it doesn't make sense to take that 4,000 units and divide it into two companies, because then we're going to have two companies producing 2,000 units each, and that's going to come at a way higher cost. Does that make sense? Let's look at it another way. Let's say at the price of 0, market demand shifts out, and now the market is demanding 8,000 units for this good. So if there are people demanding 8,000 of whatever this is, let's say it's 8,000 households who want internet service, how many firms could provide that at the lowest cost? If we want to minimize the cost of production, one firm would produce it at the lowest cost of P0 at 8,000. If we had two firms and they split the market evenly, they would have a much higher cost of producing 4,000 units, right? It'd go all the way up to, say, here, and it's going to make it way more expensive. So that's where natural monopolies come from, is from cost curves that are shaped like this and demand that's on the upward sloping part. So it's not where we to get to this point is too large of a quantity to have multiple firms. Okay? So legal monopolies are when the government creates barriers to entry by prohibiting or limiting competition. We do see legal monopolies occur in utilities. Usually, utilities have some government control. So think about PG&E, think about the local water company, think about where your utilities come from. They usually have some government control associated with them. The U.S. Postal Service was a really classic example of a legal monopoly until UPS sued for the right to deliver packages. And now we've seen some erosion of that legal monopoly. So that's another example. And then, like I said, patents and copyright laws also create legal monopolies. So what is a patent? What's a copyright? What's a trademark? Patents are it's documentation that gives the inventor of something the exclusive right to make, use, or sell the invention for a limited time. A trademark is an identifying symbol for a name or a symbol for a particular good. So like the Nike swoosh the book talks about, or Coca-Cola Red. Those kinds of things can be trademarked. Fun fact, you cannot trademark a smell. So you can always get good knockoff scents if you're into that kind of thing. Copyright is another kind of legal intellectual property protection. It is a legal protection that prevents copying work for commercial purposes. And so this applies to a lot of art, like written work, books, and music. So, for example, if I write a book, you can't reproduce it and sell it. Copyright laws are what protect people from repeating or selling copies of books online. It's what prevents people from distributing movies and those kinds of things. And then trade secrets are methods of production kept secret by the producing firm. It's not really a legal monopoly, but it's the idea of saying, hey, we have our own special way and we don't want anyone else to know. So the formula for Coca-Cola is considered a trade secret. You can think about, if you're familiar with the story of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, famously Willy Wonka closed the factory because trade secrets were getting out. And so it's not necessarily legal protection so much as it is a secret. Right? It's just something that you don't want to share that feels proprietary, but you might not have the legal ability to protect. So all of these different things fall under the idea of intellectual property. It is the idea of creating some sort of ownership of ideas, concepts, image, things that are intellectual property, right? Things that come from our minds, things that are not like, okay, you can't take my water bottle, right? It's intellectual property, not physical property. Deregulation is the idea that we should remove government controls over lots of different things. So any kind of government regulation is when we try to put controls in. And one of the responses we have to monopolies is regulation. Deregulation can be a way of helping limit monopolies too, though. If you think about it, intellectual property rights create monopolies. And so deregulation around intellectual property rights could help to limit monopoly power. So that's one way to think of it. Generally, when we think about deregulation, we can think about the history of deregulation. Your book talks a little bit about that. We see a lot of ebb and flow in regulation. When the economy is not going well, we see a rise in regulation. And when the economy is going really well, we see a rise in deregulation, limiting the government control of the economy. So let's move on. The last thing we want to talk about is predatory pricing. And predatory pricing is when a firm isn't a monopolist on accident or because of cost curves, but because they want to be a monopolist. So what they'll do is they'll use either the threat or the reality of really steep price cuts to discourage competition. This is officially a violation of U.S. antitrust law. The Sherman Antitrust Act, Section 2, prohibits the monopolization of a market. It's illegal to be a monopolist and monopolize a market intentionally, but it can be really hard to prove in courts. But what we would see in a situation with predatory pricing is a firm cutting prices to try and force people out. So an example of a case study of this might be, we see it sometimes with airlines where airlines might, if American Airlines and United are in the same marketplace, maybe United Airlines has a flight that is, they're the only ones who do that flight. They're the only ones who fly from Tulsa to San Antonio or someplace probably more rural. And then United or American says they want to come in. United can cut their prices below the cost to try and prove to American that there's no way for them to compete and keep them out of the marketplace. But it's really hard to prove because it could just be that they're running a special or they're being competitive. But generally, another way to compete or to create a monopoly is to engage in predatory pricing, to have prices so low that you scare other firms away. So that sums up, and this table does a really good job of summing up our barriers to entry. So these are different examples of different ways that monopolies can arise or exist in our markets. And then in terms of intimidating potential customers, again, we talked about predatory pricing just now, but you can also think about brands that really try to identify themselves. So think about whether or not you consider a Samsung phone to be a substitute for an iPhone. If you don't, then maybe Apple's doing a good job of creating a monopoly with their brand. So that's another way that we can kind of think of monopolies. We'll talk about that more when we get to monopolistic competition a little bit later on. But that wraps up how monopolies are created and barriers to entry. So now we can move into the next section, which is looking at how a profit-maximizing monopoly chooses their optimal price and output. So the first thing we need to remember is that the monopolist is the only firm in a market. That means they can charge whatever price they want. And this is different from what we saw with perfectly competitive markets. In a perfectly competitive market, firms were price takers. But in a monopoly, a monopolist can charge any price for their product. The only constraint is the demand curve. And so because the monopolist is the only firm in the market, they see the market demand curve. They perceive that demand curve, and that's what they respond to. So when they're out there looking at what prices to sell and what quantities of goods to put in the marketplace and what prices to charge, they're going to base that off the demand curve. They don't just see the price, they see the whole demand curve. And one way to think of that is this graph here with perceived demand and perfect competition. And so the idea is in a perfectly competitive market, firms just see price. And so they take price as a given, and that's where we get that flat marginal revenue curve. Whereas in a monopoly, the monopolist sees the whole downward sloping demand curve. And so what they see is that inverse relationship between price and quantity, whereas price goes down, quantity demanded goes up. To give you a better sense of this, let me shoot you over to a graph I made that kind of explains this in, I think, pretty good detail, because this is a really important concept for understanding this chapter. So when we talk about this idea of the perceived demand curve for a perfectly competitive market and the real demand curve for a monopolist, I like to use this example where I try to put everything together because I think it helps make more sense. So let's say we are talking about the market for gum. There are hundreds of companies producing all different kinds of gum, right? There's different flavors, different brands, different whatever. And so that might function as a perfectly competitive market or close to it. So there's some quantity and supply in the market for gum. It's going to be in that price and quantity space. There's going to be some demand curve and some supply curve. And that's the whole market for gum, right? So far, so good. There's an equilibrium quantity down here and an equilibrium price. And this is where it gets interesting. What we've talked about is this idea that a perfectly competitive market has cost curves. And it's going to be pretty similar for a market in a monopoly, the cost curves. Natural monopolies are different, right? We just talked about that. But in a perfectly competitive market, or most markets, we're going to see a firm, and this is, let's say, Trident, Extra Mint. I don't know, I'm making this up. A single gum producer. They're going to have their own marginal cost curve and average total cost curve, average variable cost curve, and so on. Where they produce is going to be a function of their marginal revenue. In perfect competition, though, remember we talked about this idea of being a price taker. Because there are so many other firms buying and selling gum, if they raise their prices too high, we'll just buy literally any other kind of mint gum. Trident is not that special. That's the idea. And so this price ends up coming from the market into the producers as the marginal revenue curve. And that's that idea of that sort of theoretically flat demand curve, or that perceived flat demand curve in perfectly competitive markets. And so a perfectly competitive firm sets marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, picks the quantity they're going to produce, and that's their price equal to marginal revenue. That's how it works in perfect competition. A monopolist is different because they're the only firm. And so these two graphs kind of get smushed together. And let me show you what I mean. Instead of there being lots of people producing gum, there's only one company producing the good. And so we still have their marginal cost curve and average total cost curve. And we're going to assume that this is not a natural monopoly. So we're going to have an average cost curve that looks something like that, maybe. But now, because they're the only firm there, they perceive the downward sloping demand curve. So what that's going to look like is this. The demand curve is going to be here in the firm's marketplace, And the marginal revenue curve is going to be downward sloping as well. And I'll explain how and why in the example. If you look on page 233 in the book, figure 9.4 and table 9.2, it goes over this, and we'll go over it together. But the basic idea is, because marginal revenue is downward sloping, because the monopolist is the only firm there, they see the demand curve. They don't see the price coming in from the market. They see the downward sloping demand curve. And that downward sloping demand curve means the more you produce, the lower you have to get the price. So they have an incentive to keep the price high and to keep the quantity low. They'll still produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost, but it's going to be a smaller quantity for the monopolist, and they can choose to charge the highest price they want because there's no competition. So that's this idea of the difference between a implied or perceived flat demand curve and the downward sloping demand curve that a monopolist perceives. Does that make sense? Okay, let's go back to the slides. Hopefully that helped make sense. So what we're going to see then is that a monopolist is going to be responding to the demand curve in a way that perfectly competitive firms can't. So the monopolist sees that downward sloping demand curve and sees the trade-off between a high level of output and a low price versus a low level of output and a higher price. And so for a monopolist, it's different from perfectly competitive firms. A perfectly competitive firm just chooses the profit maximizing quantity based on a flat, constant marginal revenue curve. A monopolist has to choose the profit maximizing quantity too, but they have to also take into account the fact that as quantity increases, price is going to decrease, and that complicates it a little bit, but it also means that they might be able to charge higher prices. So let's go take a look at how that would work. Basically, when we're calculating profits for a firm and we're comparing total cost and total revenue in a monopoly, we're going to see that total costs will rise as output increases, and the highest revenue is going to occur when total revenue is furthest from total cost. So far the same as with perfect competition. What's different is marginal revenue will also change as we change the quantity we are producing. So here we have the total cost altering and rising as we produce more, but with perfectly competitive firms, marginal revenue was a flat line. Now we see marginal revenue rising and then leveling off and then falling. So low levels of output will bring in relatively lower revenue because of the low quantity, but then high levels of output also are problematic because as the quantity increases, the price will go down and the total revenue will go down. And so the total cost curve is going to slope upward and the total revenue curve is going to slope downward, giving us a different optimal quantity for our monopolist. Luckily, your book has a great example of this where you can go through and calculate the quantity, the price, total revenue, and marginal revenue. And that helps, I think it's really, really useful to go through and actively count total revenue and marginal revenue just to get a sense of why monopolists have that downward sloping marginal revenue curve that I showed you. So let's take a look at that example now. And that's going to help you understand that the profit maximizing level of output for a monopolist is not the highest level of revenue. It's where revenue is furthest from cost. And it's not going to be a function of total revenue. It's going to be a function of marginal revenue. So take a look at the other video and then pop back in here. So this is an example from the book, table 9.2, looking at the price and quantity for a monopolist. And the big idea here is, like we said already, that a monopolist sees that downward sloping demand curve. Because they're the only firm, they're not a price taker. So they see how, as quantity goes up, willingness to pay goes down, right? And so what that's going to mean is that the price is going to change as quantity changes. So what we can do is calculate marginal revenue and prove that marginal revenue is going to be downward sloping if the demand curve is downward sloping. And that's what this is, right? The relationship between price and quantity demanded is the same as a demand curve. So first we'll get total revenue. Total revenue is just going to be price times quantity. So if this firm sells one at $12,000, total revenue is going to be $12,000. If the firm sells two at $1,100, then total revenue is going to be 2 times 1,001, right? So that's kind of the relationship. Total revenue is quantity times price. So now it's going to be, $2,200. And then here it's 3 times $1,000 or $3,000. Now we have 4 times $900, which is going to give us $3,600. 5 times $800 is going to give us $4,000. And then 6 times $700 is going to give us $4,200. 7 times $600 is also going to be $4,200. And then finally, $500 times 8 units is going to give us $4,000. So one thing we can see already is total revenue goes up by a lot, then a little, then not at all, and then it starts to go down. The price is very low, even though they're selling more. So now what we want to look at is we want to look at marginal revenue. And marginal revenue is going to be the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity. So let's write that down here. Since quantity is just changing by 1, all we have to do is look at how much total revenue changes by at each level. So we go from selling 0, so it doesn't matter what the price is, it would have been 0, to $1,200. So our change in total revenue is going to change first from 0 to $1,200, giving us a marginal revenue of $1,200. Now we go from $1,200 to $2,200. What's the marginal revenue? Remember, marginal just means how much has it changed, right? What's the additional? So the marginal revenue here is from $1,200 to $2,200. That's a change of $1,000. So now marginal revenue is $1,000. Here we go from $2,200 to $3,000. That's a marginal revenue, a change of $800. And now from $3,000 to $3,600, $600 in marginal revenue. And then going from $3,600 to $4,000 is going to be another $400 in revenue. And then another $200. And then here, total revenue doesn't change. So the marginal revenue, the change in total revenue divided by the change in quantity is 0. And then now we have a change that's negative. We have a marginal revenue that's negative $200. Does that make sense? Kinda. So what if we were to graph it? If we were to graph it, we would see exactly what I was talking about before. As quantity goes up, price is going to go down, and so marginal revenue is going to go down. So if we've got quantity of 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, 7, 8, and we can look at our initial, let's see, let's top out at price of the first unit is $1,200, so that's 1,000, that's 500, so that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, something like that. What does our demand curve look like? It's the price and quantity. So at a quantity of 1, price is $1,200. Then at 2, it's $1,100. At 3, it's 1,900. I really wish I'd labeled these. 800, 700. Oops, let's try it this way. Let me label them real quick. That's going to make my life easier and yours too. So let's do it this way. We're going to say this is 1,000 or 1,100, 1,000, 900, 800, 700, 600, 500, 400, 300, 200, 100. That'll work. Okay. Now, we start out with 1 being here, 2 is here, 3 is here, 4 is here, and so on. 800 bottoms out at $500 right there. That's our demand curve. This doesn't have to be perfect, and it's not going to be. Marginal revenue starts out at the same point. One unit has a marginal revenue of $1,200, but then the next point jumps down to $1,000. The next point jumps down to $800, then $600, then $400, then $200, then $0, and then -$200. So that's our marginal revenue curve. You see that? Does that make sense? So with the monopolist, they're not going to be a price taker. They're going to see that demand curve, and so their marginal revenue is going to be downward sloping. That's the big idea. That's the really, really big idea here when we think about them being a profit maximizer and setting their quantity and price. Okay? Cool. So hopefully that makes sense. And now you have a little bit better sense of why we don't want to find where total revenue and total cost are equal, but we want to find where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. And that's going to be how our monopolist determines their profit maximizing point. Yes, this is a little unrealistic. Economists do this all the time. In the real world, a monopolist doesn't necessarily have all of this information. A firm doesn't know exactly what would happen if it altered its production function dramatically. But monopolists actually have pretty reliable information about the small changes in output and what effect it's going to have on their marginal revenue and their marginal cost. And that allows them to calculate and estimate their marginal profit. And we love marginal measurements in economics because we like to look at the incremental change. So marginal profit is just the amount of profit one more unit of output produces. And you look at it by saying, okay, well, what's marginal revenue minus marginal cost? If marginal revenue is 400, what is marginal cost at that point? And if you go and look in the book, you can see where they go through and they compare marginal revenue to marginal cost in the table where you can see the numeric example. If you're someone who likes numbers, I highly recommend using those tables and working through calculating marginal revenue and marginal cost on your own. But for our purposes, we'll use the graphs, and I think that's really helpful too. But real quick, I'll throw it up here. So if we had our marginal revenue here, I can kind of slide this over and throw marginal cost in. Marginal cost for this example, we have our marginal revenue. Marginal cost from the table is going to be, for the first unit, is going to be a marginal cost of 500. And then the second is going to be a marginal cost of 275. And then the third is 225. The fourth is 250. See, we're going back up. That's that fishhook relationship, high, then low, and now it's going to go back up. Then from 250, it goes to $400 in marginal cost, and then $850 in marginal cost, then $1,500, and then $2,400. And so now I'll show you in the graph in just 1 second, and you can check me. But what we want to see is, as marginal revenue is also rising and then falling, and then marginal costs are falling and then rising, there's going to be a point at which they are both at 400, and that's going to be where the profit maximizing monopolist, any profit maximizing firm, wants to produce. So here's the example. Here we have the marginal costs that we just talked about, where the first is 500, then 275, 225, 250, and then 400, 850, 1,500, 2,000. And we see the same thing for the marginal revenue curve. The 1,200, 1,000, 800, 600, and then 400. That's the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And that's going to be the profit maximizing quantity for this firm. Actually, where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost is the profit maximizing quantity for any firm in any market structure. Perfect competition, monopolistic, monopolies, all of them are going to want to produce where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. What changes is the marginal revenue curve. So our monopolist would want to produce 5 units because that's where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. Cool? So if they produce any quantity below 5 units, then they are making more money than they're spending, and they could get higher profits by making more. Any point beyond this point, costs exceed revenue, and they could make higher profits by making less. So they're going to want to be at the point where marginal profit is 0, because profits are no longer rising or falling. They are exactly where they're supposed to be. Hopefully that makes sense. It's really important as we go through this stuff to really make sure you understand the difference between marginal and total. So now we want to see, using the same example of the health pill country from your book, health pill company, we want to see what it would look like for the firm in terms of their profits. So here we have the same marginal cost curve and marginal revenue curve we talked about before, and you can see how marginal revenue is derived from demand. So if the monopolist chooses to produce at marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, that's going to be this quantity of 5. The question is, what price are they going to charge? Well, they're a monopolist. They're the only firm in the market, so they're going to charge whatever price they want. What they're going to end up doing is charging a price based on the demand curve. They're going to charge the highest price possible. So in this case, they'll find this point where marginal revenue and marginal cost are equal, and then drive all the way up to the demand curve, and that will be the price they charge. So if I go ahead and graph it for you, you can see how we can compare health pills, marginal cost, marginal revenue, optimal quantity, and optimal price to the cost of production to determine their profits. So I'm going to draw the exact same graph that is on the slides and in your book. And so we've got our marginal cost curve here. Oops. And then we'll have our average cost curve here. Oops. And I'm just kind of drawing my version of it. It's not exactly perfect, but this is exactly what we're going to expect a monopolist to look like. And then they'll have the demand curve that goes down like this, and the marginal revenue curve that goes down like this. The monopolist, and this is going to be true in every market, is going to choose where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost to produce. That will be their Q star. They'll charge prices based on the demand curve. So that'll be their price. And then if we want to figure out what their total profits are, we want to compare their costs to the price they sell, right? Because remember, profit is total revenue minus total cost, which we can also measure as price minus average cost, average total cost, times quantity. So where is this firm's, here we go, cost, and where is this firm's price? There's price. Cost is going to be a function of average cost. So that's going to be right here. And so this firm's profits are going to be price out to the quantity they produce and above the costs they charge. They'll still make all this money, but this money is also going to costs. Do you see that? Hopefully that makes sense. So that's how we would calculate this firm's profit. Find marginal revenue equal to marginal cost, go up to the demand curve to get the price, and then find the average cost curve to get the cost, and then compare cost, average cost, to price and quantity. And that's how we would calculate profit. So here we can see this firm is earning positive profits. Not all monopolists earn positive profits, but you can tell by following this three-step process. First, the monopolist determines the profit maximizing quantity, which occurs at marginal revenue equal to marginal cost. They decide the price based on the demand curve. And then we calculate total revenue, total cost, and profit. So revenue is going to be price times quantity. Cost is going to be average total cost times quantity. And that'll give us total profit. Does that make sense? Try to be prepared to do this. It's really helpful to go through and practice this. And it's pretty straightforward once you get the steps down. So here's an example where we can look at a firm with a marginal cost curve right here, a marginal revenue curve here. Step one, we identify the profit maximizing quantity where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost at Q1. Now, step two, we determine the price. Price is going to be that point R. It's where the demand curve is at that quantity. Because remember, the demand curve shows us what the marginal consumer's willingness to pay is at that quantity. So at Q1, some marginal consumer is willing to pay P1. Everyone else would pay more. So at Q1, the monopolist is going to charge P1, and their costs are going to be equal to P2 because S is the average total cost at P2. So we can calculate the profits by saying what's P1 times Q minus P2 times Q, and that'll give us our profits. You can also just say it's the size or the area of the rectangle that goes from P1 to P2 and from 0 to Q1. Hopefully that makes sense. Let me know. Shoot me an email or let me know in the discussions if you'd like to see an example. We can calculate one of these together. I'm happy to do it. So why does a monopoly look so different from perfectly competitive markets? It's because the market demand curve is there and because the marginal revenue curve is based off the demand curve, because the marginal revenue curve lies beneath the demand curve. That's where the monopoly profits are going to come from. And that's one of the really, really big ideas here. The more firms enter the market, the less monopoly power a monopolist has. Why then do economists hate monopolies? Generally, we hate monopolies because they generate inefficiencies. One thing we could see is, well, there's all this economic activity that could take place that isn't. We could talk about this being units that could be bought and sold at a lower price than what the monopolist would do. We can also talk about the term allocative inefficiency versus allocative efficiency. Allocative efficiency is the idea of producing the optimal quantity of output, the quantity where marginal benefit in society is equal to the marginal cost. That's going to occur over here. I'll get my red pen back out. This is the optimal quantity for society, the allocative efficient quantity. But a monopoly is going to underproduce because they're going to be motivated by that downward sloping demand curve and that downward sloping marginal revenue curve. So monopolies are going to tend to charge higher prices and produce lower quantities, and that's going to give us this deadweight loss to society, this allocative inefficiency that's going to tend to harm society and make the economy worse. That's it. That's our chapter on monopolies. Let me know what questions you have. Let me know what you would like me to go over in more detail. Let me know what kind of examples you would like to see, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day.